this hands-on activity, students are going to be building their own model of a watershed to better understand how water flows through their environments. We recommend before starting this activity to look up your environment on Google Maps or other mapping services so that you can better understand where mountains and lakes are that are near you, and this will help students visualize those in their watershed models. Alright, so here are going to be all of our materials. We have a nice deep tray that we're going to use to build our watershed model in. We have some paper that we're going to use to crumple up to create the landforms in our watershed, some tape to go ahead and tape down those landforms, and then we have a nice piece of plastic that we'll use to cover the entirety of our watershed. And then of course we have some water and a nice cup that we'll use to pour over the watershed so that we can resemble rain. We like to use the cup with holes in the bottom so that you can better see rain and understand it a little bit easier. You can also use a watering can for this, or just a regular cup of water works too. And then at the very end, we're going to go ahead and add some pollution to our watershed. And so to resemble that pollution, we have some food coloring here. To begin building your watershed, you're going to crumple up newspaper to create the landforms. And then you're going to go ahead and start taping those landforms down to the tray so that it's nice and secure in place. Alright, so I went ahead and I made some mountain ranges and then a little bit of a canyon area over here. And then now that I'm done building my watershed model, I'm going to go ahead and take my piece of plastic and I'm going to go ahead and put this on my model and just kind of stuff it down in all the crevices to make sure that it is completely covered. You do want to make sure that where it's flat, you have it nice and tightly secure in those areas. Alright, so now that I've added some plastic onto my watershed model, it is time to go ahead and add some rain. So we're going to pretend a nice big rainstorm came through my watershed. And you want to just bring this water right over the entire thing. So now you've made a nice rainstorm all over your watershed, and you can see how water has flowed from our mountains all the way down into this little basin here, even came around this corner, which might be where a canyon might start leading out through a river or a lake or an ocean. And so these are things that you can talk about. That's why you want to try and have your watershed based a little bit off of a local area so that you can see that in your watershed. As you can see in this activity, the water flowed from our mountains down to our canyons and all centralized in that basin. And so now we're going to be adding some pollution to our watershed to understand how even if you live hundreds of miles from a lake or an ocean, that you can still affect water quality. To add some pollutants to your watershed model, we recommend using various different colors of food coloring, and you can assign those colors to be whatever you want. We like to use green to represent fertilizers and pesticides. We like to use red to represent car waste such as oil, antifreeze, or brake pad dust. You can also use brown sprinkles to represent pet waste, and then you also can use shredded up pieces of paper to represent paper pollution or plastic waste. You can also get really creative with this activity to find other different forms of pollution, and so it is open to you. So once again, we're going to pretend a big storm has come through over our watershed. And you want the students to be able to understand and see where that water is flowing. You can see that it picked up all those pollutants along the way. And so now that a storm has come through our watershed, this is a great stopping point to go ahead and talk about how maybe the pollution didn't start off here in this basin, but a big storm came through and it washed off all of our pollution that was in our mountains and our canyons or our hillsides or neighborhoods, whatever you want to pretend that this up here is, and it washed through and ended up down in our basin. So this can be your local lake, your bay, even the ocean if you happen to live near an ocean. It can also just be a large river. Whatever the water drains in your watershed, you want to make it as relatable as possible to where you live, and that is going to be a great talking point to see how all this pollution can end up in our waterways. At the end of this activity, you should be able to see that pollution that was way up in our mountains and our canyons still ended up in our waterway, and that is how a watershed works. It collects all of those pollutants and eventually takes it all to that central location, and that's how we end up with a polluted waterway.